Hello, I'm Allison Zmuda, and I am so thrilled to be joined today by Maureen and Ashley, who we've spent some time together, you and me, Maureen, over, gosh, it's been about 18 months so far, thinking about the
Yeah,
power of storyboarding in a graduate school program. But Maureen, can you introduce yourself?
surely. So I am very happy to say that I am a faculty member at Sacred Heart University in Fairfield, Connecticut. And we are really privileged to have an EDD program, a doctorate in educational leadership, that focuses on social, emotional, and academic leadership. And so I get to work on a regular basis with aspiring uh, future leaders in that space from all over the country because it's an asynchronous online program, although it has a very personal component in that we meet regularly in each class on Zoom, and we have a summer residency program. And so while I prefer to be with people in person, this really works for us, and it's a privilege to be a part of that program. One of the privileges is working with people like Ashley Freeman, who just finished her doctoral journey, and she survived quite well. And so I'm happy to be here with her because one of the things that we have really embraced in the courses that I teach and in the program as a whole is the idea of using storyboard methodology to really make the work that we do accessible and available to people so that we can change lives through education.
Absolutely. So, Maureen, we're going to get into all of that in a minute or two. But Ashley, if you can just introduce yourself, that would be fantastic.
Sure. I'm Ashley Freeman. I'm lucky enough to have, as Dr. Ruby shared, graduated from the program that she was discussing and have professors brilliant like Dr. Ruby who exposed us to the storyboard methodology. I don't think I ever looked back. And so they allowed me to really embrace that both in my dissertation defense proposal and defense. And so I'm just thrilled to be here to be able to talk a little bit more about my experience with storyboarding.
Wonderful. So as we start getting started, Maureen, as we start to think back on our early time together, you started connecting with storyboarding very early on. I think it was even before the book came out that I wrote with Heidi. So you started putting together, cobbling together the ideas and bringing it into your classroom right away. And then over the course of, again, about 18 months, we continued to think and imagine and co-create the idea of a curriculum storyboarding methodology. So can you talk a little bit why you immediately started to see it as a methodology? And what are the powers and parameters that come with thinking about it as a methodology?
Sure. One of the things about language is that people throw terms around all the time. And sometimes we don't really know what the terms mean to other people. And so the idea of a methodology or a framework, if you talk to people and you really put the question, to them about what's the difference, first there's a kind of a deer in the headlights look. And this doesn't mean that people aren't intelligent or don't understand what you're talking about, but we use terminology without really having a common understanding. And so when I started really delving into trying to understand storyboards through the work that you and your colleagues did, the work you did with Heidi Hayes-Jacobs and whatnot, and listened to webinars and read blogs, I started thinking about what is this really? And when I thought about storyboarding, I kept coming back to methodology. And a methodology, there are definitions, but is something that's really structured. It's a step-by-step systematic process. And it's used to really design thinking with projects and seeing projects through. So the people who are working on the project all have a clear understanding of what the components of the project are. So there's a method. And so I didn't want to engage with students in my graduate classes or with people in schools and have, I'll use the term, like a willy-nilly kind of idea of what a storyboard was, because then it wouldn't solve and help with the problem that it was set out to solve in the book, Streamlining the Curriculum. Starting with that problem of curriculum not being accessible to even the people who were implementing it, the teachers or the students or the parents. We could go off on all kinds of tangents if we were thinking about the storyboard as this very flexible, whimsical framework that you could just do in any which way. So I started using the idea of methodology, and I think it was a January webinar, and I used the term methodology. And after the webinar was over, you looked at me and you said methodology, like, let's unpack that. And so that's how that came to be. And when we think about the methodology, I don't know how much you want to go into it, but there's really two essential components of a storyboard, and they're necessary. So we need to have the board, and we need to have a systematic process for what goes onto that board. So that's the story component. So that's really how it came to be. And I wanted to make sure that when I was working with, at first, I introduced this to aspiring leaders in our leadership certification program. I wanted to make sure that if I was going to have them work with this, and this was prior to your book being published, that we were all on the same page and had an understanding. Otherwise, I could be wasting their time having them work to create storyboards.
Yeah. So, Ashley, as you started to begin to think about the construct of the methodology, so you have the story, which is the visual narrative or thread, and then you have the board, which are the core components that you're developing and sharing systematically. What was your initial take on it in the work that you've done with Dr. Ruby as part of your coursework? And let's start to see how that impacted your thinking in relation to your dissertation.
Yeah, I think that's, what an interesting question, right? Because at that point in my course of study, we had looked at tons of research articles. We were reading research all the time. So when it was first introduced, it kind of gave me a moment of pause, like, wait, we're going to brainstorm images now. And like, it felt like, but in a beautiful way, it was like a return to my roots as an educator, right? So it felt affirming, but also confusing for a moment. But I think as we started looking at, being bold enough to present your proposal in this way, I jumped right in, because what resonated with me very quickly was, I have worked a long time in middle school and teaching kids a story arc, right? And so what are the core components of the story we're trying to tell, and how do we clearly communicate that? How is an author communicating that to the reader or the audience? And so it really helped me figure out, okay, let's distill this story I'm trying to tell down into the essential components. And so it really helped. I think sometimes, especially as a young researcher, you want to throw everything at the wall and see what sticks, especially when you're doing a proposal defense. But it really helped me sort through the research and say, okay, what's key here? What do I need to be sure to communicate in a very clear way? What's kind of extraneous at the moment? And what story am I trying to propose that I want to be able to tell and continue to explore? For me, that started with looking and doing that work, and then thinking about what I really got excited about is what image really helps convey that to the audience or the reader at this point. So if I could show an image that could help people connect to an idea that I was trying to tell. And I tried to do that kind of metaphorically with the images that I chose, and then actually created through AI, which is amazing and so helpful actually to this process, I believe. And so that's kind of how it went. I think the most genius thing, well, she said many, but one of the most genius things that Dr. Ruby ever said was like, and wait, to be continued, right? And so it was that moment like, yes, especially in improvement science, like this is a proposal defense and the story will be continued and then hopefully continued after the cycle is done. And so that was kind of like how I approached the work. What was also really helpful to me was to pull a central quote or something I had read that could help frame like like a quote to start off each component or each chapter of the story. So in my proposal, it has a chapter, and then it will give the research below it and the focus of that part of the story. But then it will also give the reader, the audience, something to think about, something that helps you ponder at that point in my work to help drive the research forward or to tell the story or drive the story forward.
So let's step back for a moment, Ashley. I want you to sort of think about the idea that, yes, the storyboard is such a powerful communication tool, a way to share your thinking with others. But talk a little bit more about how designing the storyboard impacted your own thinking. So in what ways did it help clarify, illuminate? Just walk us through that part in terms of the sense making that you were doing outside of the communication tool.
Yeah, I mean, I actually think that I always knew kind of the work that I was doing was about student engagement and the research, but the storyboard, the process helped to really refine the research that I was doing. So for example, it really pulled out that while I was looking at student engagement, it was really not strategies in isolation. It was really more this idea about coherence and a coherent story. And so the storyboarding process really helped surface that more clearly in a lot of ways, because when I laid out the research visually, starting with this connection, moving upstream towards this redesign idea, I could really kind of articulate that student disengagement isn't a failure of effort or motivation. It really helped to show that it's a systems issue, and it's fragmented initiatives where leadership is unstable and that the expectations weren't aligned. So in telling the story and doing the work, the storyboard made visible something that I had kind of felt for years as a practitioner, the process of doing it, that schools are doing so many things, but not necessarily the things aren't fitting together in a certain kind of a way, and that the system outcome is student engagement at this moment in time. And I think seeing that detail across the frames of the story helped clarify my theory of improvement and then kind of name coherence as a real lever for change.
Maureen, can you talk a little bit about the kinds of things, in addition to what Ashley just started to describe, ways that you heard people that were creating dissertation proposals through storyboarding? Were there certain like prompts or insights that they had along the way to help develop or deepen their thinking?
Well, building on what Ashley said, and the need for a story to have cohesion and coherence, by having to use the storyboard to frame out their dissertation proposal, it illuminated what I call magical leaps, or what you might call gaps in their story thinking. Okay, so while narrative and the history of narrative is sometimes presented in contrast to a logic way of thinking, there is a logic inherent in the storyboard as a tool, as a cohesive tool, as the methodology, because there has to be a connection from one panel or one chapter to the next. You don't just have willy-nilly chapters in a story. It's not a narrative. And so that very essence of the methodology, student after student who actually responded on a survey that they were given about the use of storyboards, identified gaps in their own research thinking. And so that drove them back. And that wasn't, and Ashley, I'd love to have you chime in on this, that those, what I'm calling magical leaps or gaps, they were not always evident when the student did a traditional like PowerPoint or presentation as they went through the slides. But when you have to put it on a storyboard and you have to follow the methodology and the research basis of what a storyboard really is, the disconnects show up like lightning. So that was one really important theme.
Yeah, I would say absolutely. I think that oftentimes, I think when we looked at, and I experienced both, right? I've given both types of presentations, but kind of in a traditional presentation, you jump from one slide to the next and they don't necessarily connect. There's I'm doing this because this is what I need to do to have my research be valid and acceptable. So I'm talking to you about initial research that I've done. I'm talking to you about the number of participants in my research. I'm talking to you about what I found, and it's all numbers. And then in the end, I'm coming to some kind of conclusion. But to Dr. Ruby's point, when you lay it out in a storyboard that's so concise, right, and that you have a small amount of space to tell a really powerful story, you identify the gaps, right? Why did I do that? And maybe I should have rethought that. And what's the next step? And is there a voice that's missing? And are all of the characters present, right? And who is the real protagonist in this story? And what is the actual context, right? So what's important about this setting? So it really helps just refine, I think, the story and make for a more robust, fuller story, and checks the researcher in saying, like, have all the voices of the characters been heard? And is there a voice that's been left out? And is there a component of this story that you might have inadvertently left out in telling it, right? And that might be really important to hear. And I found that came out for me, and it allowed people to really understand my story so much so that when I presented my final defense, what most blew me away, I mean, you always look for nods from your committee, like you're looking for people to say, like, yep, I agree. But in the end, when they asked me questions, what was so profound is that they all started by saying, I was just at a conference and that resonated with me. What you said, or this part of your story, hey, have you thought about the next chapter? So people were able to locate themselves in the story. And I think for a scholar practitioner scholar, that's really important, right? Because we do research because we've identified what we believe is a real issue or a challenge. And we set out to solve or start to identify pieces of the puzzle that need to be identified to solve the problem. But I think so often research is done, and then researchers present it, but it doesn't resonate with practitioners because it seems so removed that I think in this way, the storyboard allows all the audience to see themselves in the story, and then it becomes more alive, and in that way closes the research to practice gap. It's really beautiful because we do the research to solve a problem, and if it doesn't get into the hands of people that are doing the work, I'm not sure it really mattered, right? So I think it improves also the mattering of the work that we're doing.
Well, as you started to clarify the dissertation defense, Ashley, if you can just walk us through quickly about the organizing frame, how you set it up, and we'll dig in a little bit more into the committee's reaction to it. So, and by the way, you'll also have access to this if you want to see the PDF in bigger font. I know Ashley has it bigger on her home screen, but just walk us through the idea of how you organized or laid it out.
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, my computer is just pausing for a moment. But what I will say is, it flipped it for me. Yeah, so when I set out, like I said, I looked at, obviously, we included the framing questions at the top. And for me, the framing questions were important for the research, but I had this real idea at the point of the proposal defense about, like, what if student engagement isn't really the root of the problem at all? What if the real issue is student disengagement, right? So not about student achievement, rather, isn't the real issue. And so from there, I really laid out, let's start with the disconnect, like what's happening in classrooms today, and really framed kind of that idea about, like, what happens if students stop seeing school as a place of purpose. And here I'm really looking at the problem of practice in a local school system and seeing kind of what exists in the literature, but also what teachers are saying in the district. And so that was really the focus of the story. And that really led me back to this idea that kept swirling in my head about, like, every system is perfectly designed to get the result it gets. And in this particular school system, Harborview, the result has been teachers talking about the issue of student engagement or disengagement in the classroom. So from there, I thought about, like, like I said, visuals are really important to me, this idea of a disconnect. So like the pieces are in place, they're just not put together in the way I would hope, which is represented by that plug. What happened next is I wanted to start really dialing into kind of what folks are saying. So the next chapter to me, I started really looking at what educators and researchers are telling us about the importance of student engagement and disengagement. And that engagement is not a student trait, it's really a system outcome. And really focusing in on literary themes that were tied. So the idea of generational dissonance. So today's learners, what's the disconnect with the learning they're experiencing in schools, presenting the educator voices that I was hearing in the district, and bringing up for me that led me to the idea that like these are the echoes, what we're hearing in the hallways, what we're hearing in the classroom. And so for me, it was a mix of literature and like kind of hearing and this idea that concentric circles, right? We talk about it. What do different groups of people thinking about the same topic? And then we knew that we wanted to build a path forward together. The idea that I'm working closely with educators and alongside them in the district in this improvement science process to really think through what could happen, what's feasible to happen. And in my dissertation, what I knew was that I wanted to generate an idea, not to necessarily that the end result would be a generating of a coherent idea for the district. So here I present my working theory of improvement. I started thinking through my driver diagram and generating specific inquiry questions. And so for me, that was like the design table, a meeting of the minds with educators and administrators in the district to really brainstorm and really dial into what is the challenge, what information do we still need, what are we curious to learn to understand what is feasible for the district. And then the last chapter for my defense anyway, for my proposal defense anyway, was like kind of this idea of what's one small shift towards a bigger change idea. And for me at this time, it was the 60-minute session that was designed to spark clarity, coherence, curiosity, and action. Mm-hmm. And so I started putting together, and I lay out here kind of like what I was thinking at the time about professional learning sessions for educators and why it would be important. And then for me, it was like a footprint in the sand, right? Like one step forward, but a small step towards, like I said, this was going to be the first step of a bigger kind of issue of coherence in the district. And so kind of like, and then Dr. Ruby added her amazing to be continued, which I had left off initially. Of course, that's the most important part, that this is a defense of what will be done and what will come of it, we don't know.
Absolutely.
The storyboard really allowed me, and even putting this together into a storyboard, it really allowed me to think through the pieces. Like, do I have everything as a younger researcher? Like, do I have all the pieces laid out, and have I collected what I need? And does this tell the shaping of this change idea? So that's kind of like how I went about this storyboard.
So 2 points, and then I'm going to bring Maureen into this conversation as well. The first thing is like the care and attention that you've taken with the visual images. While it's probably illegible for most people to lean in and read any of the text, the visual images really are so thought-provoking and beautifully considered. It helps tell the story even if the text is too small to read. So while you'll have access to that as part of a PDF later for folks that are just listening to this, we're happy to share that with you. But I think at the same time, really thinking about the emotional connection those images is central to the telling of the story and the care in which Ashley designed it and created those. And the second thing is I want to clarify that there are two kinds of storyboards. The first kind of storyboard is exactly what Ashley's describing. This is what Heidi Hayes Jacobs and I call an emergent storyboard. So it's by design, the story so far. We may have a beginning, as Ashley said, like her research really was leaning into the idea of student disengagement and the impact that it has on achievement. but at the same time, she didn't know where the story was going to lead her.
Yes.
And so it is significant and important that storyboards, emergent storyboards, are something that are initiated by the student ideally, so that they can actually navigate their own learning journey. That's very different from a curriculum storyboard that is designed where you already have a beginning, middle, and end. And again, Maureen, you've sort of shepherded the design of these kind of learner research initiated storyboards where it's emergent, but you've also spent some time designing storyboards that already had a beginning, middle, and end because of the course design. So can you give us a little insight about the ideas of both of them? What stood out to you?
Okay, so that's a big question. So I'm going to try to really focus the leadership students. And it was for the purpose of that beginning, middle, end type of approach for them to use storyboard methodology to present, communicate curriculum. Mm-hmm. Interestingly, to communicate it to themselves as well as to their students and their parents or other stakeholders. And that was my first foray into using this methodology in the higher ed classroom. The emergent storyboard seemed to be such a novel way to support students from becoming victims of their own energy in a doctoral program. Because people come into doctoral programs, they haven't even taken a course, and they go, I know what I want to do my study on. And it's like, no, you don't. Even when you have things all fleshed out, you may not really know what your study is going to be about. And that is just such a difficult, I remember going through that myself in my doctoral program. And that is just such a difficult point to get across. And then came the idea of using the storyboard methodology as a way to support the type of thinking that we need doctoral students to be able to do, to emerge as scholarly practitioners in their work, and to not become victim of a predetermined notion, because that's really all it is, of what they think they're going to be doing. And I think that we have many examples of this, but Ashley's particularly is a strong example of how the use of storyboard methodology really scaffolded the evolution and the natural development of the study, and that she was not able, it's impossible almost, if you're being true to the process, to constrain the research as it unfolds, because you're writing the story while you're doing the work. You don't know how it's going to end. And there could be multiple endings to the story. So that's why to be continued. And Ashley, did your story end the way you might have thought it was going to end?
No, it was a real surprise, actually. And I had been writing, and then I had gone to my chair and said, God, it's just, I'm feeling uninspired with where we are. And she said, well, go home and look it over, take some time away from it. And the next Monday I remember I was driving in my car, and somebody said something about coherence. And I was like, oh my gosh, they're missing a framework. Like I've got it. Right. And so I went back and I was like, I remember I called Dr. Wallace and I said, Dr. Wallace, I know I toe the line a lot with some crazy kinds of outside the box systems level thinking, but could you look at something and tell me if I've totally jumped over the line this time? And she looked at it and she said, no, this is exactly what your story needed. Right. So it really allows you, like I was thinking about what Dr. Rudy was just sharing, but and you're really like, I found co-authoring it, right? Like I am scribing it, but I'm co-authoring it with actors in the district, right? Who are telling me their lived experiences. And I'm cross-checking that with what literature says and what other people are experiencing in other parts of the country to say, hey, does this make sense? And what sense can we make of this together? So it was like the process was mirroring, the process of creating the storyboard was mirroring and allowing for the process of the research. They kind of talked to each other. And so I thought that was absolutely so helpful for me as a student, even when I did go to write the final and create the storyboard for my dissertation defense. Like I was able to really articulate, like, I began by seeing the system as it was, and learning from those who lived it was chapter 2 for me. And then I thought about designing for coherence in chapter 3. And now I see that we have to rethink what counts, right? And that's a TBD too, because that to be continued, rethinking what counts is a much bigger conversation that we need to continue to investigate. So it was really interesting.
Well, and Ashley, I want to bring back something that you said earlier on, and connecting to what you're sort of chatting about now, is that the way in which you co-created, co-authored, collaborated with the folks in your school is significant, because when they started to talk about what resonated with them, that actually continued to spark your thinking, your design, which also is connecting back to what the committee started to say as well. So when you're thinking about the committee's response to the storyboard, you started to talk about like what resonated with them. They saw, oh, that was part of the research that I did, or I just went to a conference where that was part of it. So can you talk a little bit more about tuning back into the committee's response and thinking about how story or narrative actually is inviting people to the table rather than feeling like they're just the recipients of yet another slide presentation?
Yeah, I mean, I think in the end, and to your point, what stood out the most at the end was that all the questions started with their own stories. So like, I've seen this pattern in schools when, or I was just at a conference and it really reminded me of this idea that I wanted to bring up now. So what I think that showed me was, instead of just challenging, interrogating the research, questioning the research, which is their job, right, to make sure that it's sound, from a distance, they were locating themselves inside the narrative. So they found a piece of the story that resonated, or the whole story that resonated with them. And that kind of engagement, I think, happens only when people see their own experience reflected back to them. And so in that way, it confirmed for me that the storyboard wasn't just about communicating findings, although it does that very brilliantly. It was about creating a shared language. I know Dr. Ruby talked earlier about the power of language, but for understanding systems and understanding problems, and just start exploring solutions together, because we need a collection of voices to really unpack some of today's problems in education. And so
if I could just add in, if I could just add in, sorry to jump on, but what the other thing that I felt happened, and I knew your work intimately, but when I was sitting there, I wanted to do what I just did to you. I wanted to jump in to the story. I wanted to be part of the story. So in a sense, to use a social emotional term, you're telling the story, you're talking about your research through narrative, was kind of co-regulating my thinking and my response to what you were doing. Even though it's like I already read the book. I already knew the story. But because it was told, the research was told through this storyboard methodology, I still wanted to be in it. Because when you read a good book or you watch a good movie and somebody says, do you want to watch it again? Or would you read this book again? You say yes. And when you do it, you still get something else out of it. You still engage with the author. You're still, questioning the author while you're reading the book that you already read, and you're having different ideas. And that's what you did to us. And so what I loved about this and talking to other faculty, Ashley was the only one. We didn't offer people to do their dissertation defense with a storyboard, but Ashley wrote us a letter and asked if she could do this. We did offer the opportunity for people to use the storyboard methodology for their proposal defenses. So I just wanted to clarify that. So, I knew her, what was going on with her intimately, but I was so engaged. Let's be honest. Sometimes it's not so exciting to go to defenses. Not that you're not interested in the work or anything, but slide presentations can get, like death by PowerPoint. Yeah. So I just want to add that in because it's a perfect example of how the brain craves narrative.
Well, and Dr. B, I would say too, I went to quite a few of my colleagues' defenses because I wanted to be supportive, but I'm also so curious to learn what people are finding and what people are learning about. And what I would say is, after seeing a few of them, I always got excited for the questions because that's when people really came alive, right? And they got to bring themselves into the work, to talk about why they chose the topic, to talk about why it mattered, to talk about, it was always like, what's next, right? And so hearing them talk about the work continues was the most magical part I felt of the defense presentation because the work is real. People are choosing topics that they're passionate about. And I don't think it doesn't cut to Dr. Ruby's point. It doesn't always come across in a research presentation. So in that way, I felt like the storyboard allows that to happen way earlier. Mm-hmm. And again, at the end of mine, when I was talking about after pitching a framework and like all the rethinking that I believe needs to be done in schools today, I didn't just get emotional because I had finished my defense, although I was really excited about that and maybe relieved. But I felt like a sense of like a really emotion. I was so connected to the story that I was telling and the way that people were hearing the story that I almost got emotional at the end because I felt like
you did get emotional.
Right, but like what a powerful story we created. Yeah. This is a story that's worthy of people hearing. And while the students weren't directly engaged in the research that I did, bringing them back to saying like, and all of this is for children. Like this is the work we're doing for children as educators and why most of us got into the work to begin with. So it felt really powerful and that people came together to say, oh my God, I see myself in that story. I felt like that's the hope, right? That's in education, the hope that we hold for children and support we hold for each other.
Well, and I think, Maureen, one of the things that we were playing with in terms of an idea around the story part of the storyboard methodology is that the story is designed to invite the reader, the viewer, the listener in so that they're actually rooting alongside of you, actually navigating the twists and turns with you. So it's intriguing, as Ashley, you're starting to describe it, is that when you're sort of comparing it to more traditional dissertation defenses, the Q&A sometimes is the part where people feel they can actually be themselves and share their purpose, their interests, their heartaches as they were doing the research, which is so late in the game. And I think that the dynamic of using the storyboard as a way to frame the thinking, to frame the learning, you're putting that purpose, that why, and that journey front and center so that you're surfacing the seminal research that you found and some of the actions that you've taken. But at the same time, that weaving is something that you're doing with the audience members in real time, rather than them sort of enduring the presentation so that they can actually lean in and engage with you after.
Absolutely. And we had talked about this a little before, but for me, right, storytelling has been done since the beginning of time. It is how we most often communicate with each other. And that's why when you talked about the images, what I would say to that is, so often in schools, we talk about text, and texts today are words on paper, but they're also pieces of art, right? And so for me, identifying the right artwork for the storyboard was equally important because stories are told through images and pictures, and so that the picture, a picture can tell 1,000 words. So or speak 1,000 words. So I wanted to be sure they were just right. But I think because storytelling is such an essential component of the universal human experience, it's how we make meaning and affirm our shared humanity. For educators, support one another and understand what we're going through or have hope for the future. While my research kind of really, I believe, investigated a serious problem, student disengagement today in classrooms, it did that, but the lived experience of that problem, to your point, is very emotional, right? So if you're a teacher in the classroom and you're working with young people and they're very disengaged, showing up every day, it is a very emotionally draining, can be emotionally charged topic. And I think the storyboard allowed me to hold that very honestly, right? Like that images, like I was able to show in the presentation around the storyboard of like students drowning and educators feeling overwhelmed and pulling kids from the water and throwing initiatives at a wall. These aren't just metaphors. These are truly reflective of how people in education are feeling, and the different characters in the story are feeling inside of a system that's self-perpetuating. And so I think once I allowed those emotions into my narrative, and which the storyboard methodology allows, my intellectual understanding actually sharpened, because I could see more clearly how frustration, how fatigue, and disconnection are not distractions from the improvement work. That's why I love the question part so much. They are indicators of system strain, like where are the pinch points in the system? And you will see that by the way people react to them. And so the storyboard helped me treat emotion as data in a sense, rather than just something to be minimized or a lesser important part of the story, where we just as researchers have to get to the numbers, right? They are, it's almost like the third part. Like there's the quantitative part, there's the qualitative part, and there's the emotional part. Like what were people sharing and how are they sharing that with you?
So I know you had to ask for special dispensation to do the dissertation defense as a storyboard. What would you say to folks for this upcoming year if they're curious about seeing if this is a good fit for them?
I mean, I would say, first of all, that they're in a place that is embracing storyboarding. And so it's a great opportunity to really try it out. And what I think storyboarding, what we've all said, is that it invites people into the space with you. And so as we all are doing in this program in the EDD, you've chosen to pursue a degree that's very close to the work, right? We're doing the work as practitioners. And so because we sit in that's our positionality, to invite people into the story with you is exceptionally important as we close this research to practice gap. So I would strongly encourage folks to, although it's different, to give it a shot, because I believe that it helps to tell a really important story and brings people with you along in the journey. And it is in that way that we can better support one another as educators and really get the information and our findings out into the universe.
And Maureen, you're going to have the last word. So the same question to you for folks that are interested in thinking about not just imagining their proposal, but their defense through the lens of a storyboard. What kind of impact do you think it might have in terms of the it's not just the quality, but the engagement of both the researcher as well as the committee?
Well, I think the storyboard serves as a lifeline, really, to the student scholar, to be able to do all the things that we've been talking about. When you work as hard as doctoral students do, it's almost anticlimactic to flip through a PowerPoint slide deck.
Yep.
You have put your heart and soul into the work that you're doing, which is important work that is going to serve many people and help make lives of children and teachers better. You've sacrificed, you can't sacrifice your job because you'll get fired. So people are sacrificing their home life and their personal life and their personal relationships. I see Ashley, acknowledging that, to be able to do this work, right? That's important. That's a huge sacrifice. And so you don't want it reduced in that last hour of your journey to flipping through slides. You want it to take on a life of its own that penetrates the world and brings other people along on the journey of the narrative of your work. And so a way that we know that this can happen is through using storyboard methodology to tell the story of your journey as a scholarly practitioner.
Well, that's a beautiful last word. So I am just privileged to have both Ashley and Maureen spending a little bit of time thinking about the visual dissertation from proposal to defense. So if you want to get more information, I'll share the information to connect with Dr. Ruby as well as Ashley and the PDF of the dissertation defense. So thank you so much for joining us, and looking forward to seeing you again with the next interview. Take care.
Okay. Take care. Thank you.
Thank you.